The idea today is a little bit of concluding history to tie in some of the loose ends, and then we'll just take a look at a Mishnah. Now, this is intended for people who have no background whatsoever. Are you qualified, Rabbi Weinberg?
Fully qualified.
You're qualified, okay. But with no background whatsoever. That's was how it was set up for me when the arrangement for the class was made. I mentioned last time that Rabbi Judah the Prince, according to two opinions, either he authored the Mishnah or he redacted the Mishnah. According to one opinion, he had before him perhaps a note or two, but really it was only it was through his own divine inspiration that he authored it. That's the religious point of view. The other point of view is, starting with Rabbi Akiva, the oral tradition from Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik, which is immediately post-Jewish scriptures, from that period of time, around the 300s, 330, 340, before the Common Era, all the way up to Rabbi Akiva's time, and he will pass away by the year 133 of the Common Era. During this period of time, there were a lot of investigations into the application of the law, and Rabbi Akiva, according to the second opinion, began to write it down more formally, and his major disciple was given the task of continuing it, and that would be Rabbi Meir. And what Rabbi Judah Prince did, according to the second opinion, was he took it and he finished it, or he formalized it. There are two other bodies of documents that play a role in the Mishnah. One that clearly predates it, and parts of it are contemporaneous and parts of it postdated. And the other body appears to be primarily, at least according to one opinion, contemporaneous or post-dating it. And that's the brises and the toseftas. The word brisa in Aramaic means outside, meaning it wasn't included. It also means to clarify when you Hebraicize it. The tosefta, there's actually no such word as tosefta. The actual word is tosefata. Tosefta is yeshiva talk. It's just a thing in yeshiva to deliberately mispronounce Hebrew by taking the Aramaic structure, the Aramaic linguistic approach to Hebrew. And so it's commonly called tosefta, and if you said tosefata, people wouldn't even know what you're talking about. We have similar words like this. We say tosfos. People always say tosfos, but it's always tosafos. It's not tosfos. These two bodies of literature, it's sort of important to understand the role that they play before we dig into the Mishnah. The tosefta, there's a variety of opinions. The primary opinion is, because Rabbi Yochanan said so in the Gemara, that it was authored by Rabbi Nehemiah. That's certainly the given answer, and that's the way that we hold. But the Tosefta is a very large body of work. It's much larger than the Mishnah itself. And as a result, there are parts of it that would seem to indicate that Rabbi Nehemiah probably didn't write that part. It is actually a supplement or an appendix. Its role is not to clarify the Mishnah per se, although it's used in that fashion. This is really, it follows the Mishnayos exactly. It follows the same order. I mentioned last week 6 tractates of Rabbi Judah the Prince with the 6 orders with the 60 tractates. Just to clarify, that's the general way of counting. Just like we have a debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides, which of the commandments make up the 613, and they both come to 613, but which ones they differ if you take a look. So too when it comes to adding the tractates, depending upon combining and splitting, there could be 61 or 63. I'm just cutting off at the pass certain experts in the room that are still sulking because last week I said there's 60 with finality when it's possible that there's 61 or 63. Same thing when it comes to the Tosefta. There are parts of it that probably were not necessarily added by Rabbi Nehemiah or Rabbi Yeshaya. Some of the complaints that people would make with the Mishnah and the Tosefta is that Rabbi Akiva speaks in the first person. So that would lend credence to the opinion that it was divine inspiration, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who came after them, because how could they write a book about what they're going to say? And the answer is that the materials were developed over a period of time, and they could have said it. They just said, I say this. And later, Rabbi Akiva, even though he said, I said this, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, could say, Rabbi Akiva said this. In other words, it's unusual for a person to speak in the first person. Shlomo says. That doesn't sound right. So it must have been not written by you. Be that as it may, there's no proof that Rabbi Akiva began the formulation or didn't begin the formulation. There's no proof one way or the other. But the Tosefta clearly is not primarily a clarification or used for elucidation of the Mishnah. It is, if anything, perhaps a simultaneously developed document, and because it's extremely expansive, it's very useful to look at the Tosefta and match it up with the Gemara, the Mishnah that you're reading, and you will find something that's not mentioned here that's mentioned. The way I understood it in yeshiva was, even if the parts of the Tosefta were available in that format, either orally or written, to Rabbi Judah the Prince, the reason why he didn't use it, this according to the opinion that Rabbi Nehemiah didn't write it, was because it's too expansive, and his intent was to maintain as a tradition oral as much as possible, but where necessary to write it down. You must realize the objective of the Mishnah, and the objective is to have pity on children that are in second grade. That's the major purpose for the style of writing. Because if Rabbi Judah the Prince had written expansively with all the details, the poor school children in the third grade who would be responsible for memorizing the Mishnah for Friday's test, it would be Rahmanas on them. They wouldn't be able to watch TV in the afternoon or play soccer in the afternoon. They'd have to spend the whole day and the whole night memorizing it. Keeping this in mind, I'm sure, this is part of the divine inspiration, Rabbi Judah the Prince said, how can I make this as concise as possible to have Rahmanas on school children so that they could memorize it? But the other point of view is, on a more serious note, is even though it was an aberration to write things down, and if you'll check the YouTube, I did give the sources of when you can, why you can't write it down. You could look it up there. The reason why he allowed the writing down was because of the conditions of the time, but his intent was that it still be oral as much as possible. And therefore, he deliberately chose to write as concisely as possible, where he could have expanded. It was certainly a reasonable thing to do at that time, because where he chose to be concise was that he wanted you to endeavor to learn it orally. And where necessary, then you can rely on the writing. I mentioned last week that could be, the last month, that it was like perhaps 20, 30 years later that it was available in writing. According to some opinions, it would be the better part of 100 years before it was available in writing. But when they say that, they mean commonly available. It was available immediately in his time, perhaps like Rashi in terms of some pamphlets, but it then became available within 20 or 30 years. Some opinions say it wasn't available for perhaps even 100 years commonly, but that doesn't mean that it didn't exist in print. But the intent was never to rely on the print version. Today, on the contrary, everything is relying on the print version. The brises, on the other hand, many of the brises, it's obvious.
So how did all of the yeshivas until then learn? What did they have in the yeshivas?
Well, as I mentioned last time, the leaders of all the yeshivas had their own private notes.
Right.
So they had that.
So everything
But
was given over orally.
Yes, and there was Tanatuna. There was somebody who was an expert who had memorized all the various pieces of legislation.
That's every Tanya knew everything.
No, there were people that their job was to memorize. And what would happen is, when the rabbi would come in to commence the address, the Tanatuna, the one who had memorized it, would stand up and would recite the piece of legislation and would sit down. And then the rabbi
What's the tuna?
taught.
Tana,
Yeah, that's conjugate.
Wasn't those are the Amoraim?
What's that?
The Amoraim?
The Amoraim come later, but the Amoraim had a Tana. The early Amoraim had a Tana. That was the person who would do exactly what I was saying. The Rebbe once spoke about this, that apparently there were people who had had an interest in Yale Khan's academy, and it was becoming fierce competition to sit before the Rebbe to memorize the Rebbe's every word, especially on Shabbos and Yom Tov. And it got to the point where people were neglecting what the Rebbe was saying in favor of memorizing the words. And the Rebbe spoke in a Sikha, I happened to be there at the time, where he spoke about the Tana Tuna, and he said that this was not a prestigious position. This was not a person who was held up high in the community. And I don't remember his exact words, it's been too many years, but it was something to the effect of, it was a nebuch, that he had no idea what he was saying. It would be like a person speaking Hebrew phonetically and having no clue what he's actually saying. But he had an amazing ability to memorize, but he didn't know what it meant. The brises were, some of them were very old and far predate Rabbi Judah the Prince, which is not amazing, because sometimes we will see in the Talmud it will say Mishnah Rishona, an early Mishnah, or it'll say an old Mishnah or a new Mishnah. So obviously there were some Mishnayos that were in the precise form that we find it today in the Mishnah were already redacted, a few of them, in prior to Rabbi Judah the Prince's time, because we have references to them. If there were Mishnayot there, if there were Mishnayos back then clearly there were brises, because the brises were attempts at saying the same point, but they were far more expansive. And according to the opinion that the Rabbi Judah the Prince was the redactor, he looked at all of the various summaries from all the leading teachers of the day and prior to that, and he selected the one that was the most concise, the most precise, and the rest are called the brises. Those have correct information in them, but they're not as general. They're not as they use more words to say less, whereas the Mishnah uses fewer words to say more. It's applicable in more cases, and as a result, in the Talmud, in order to understand the meaning of a Mishnah, quite frequently a technique that will be used is to bring a brisa that's similar and note the differences. Now, whenever this happens, you always have to keep in mind, if there's a debate between the Mishnah and the brisa, you already know who to root for. You already know who's going to win. Certainly the Mishnah outranks the brisa. The brisa is always considered secondary. In an area where brisa was expansive and the Mishnah doesn't speak, the brisa would be more authoritative than the Amoraim, the sages of the Talmud who came later.
So what did he base his rulings on if the Mishnah is arguing with the Braisa?
What we said last time, which one was the truest to the teachings of the seven teachers?
What is a brisa, Rabbi?
The word brisa means outside, literally, meaning that it wasn't the one chosen. That's the Aramaic root. In the Hebrew root, it means clarification. And so it's because what we use it for. So these are pieces of legislation that were, let's say, I'll give you an example. Suppose you have a House bill that then goes to the Senate. The Senate had its own version. They pass a Senate bill, and there are differences between the House and the Senate. It now goes back to the House where the process ends, if and only if you can get it to the process called reconciliation. And there's rules to reconciliation. You can reconcile as long as there's no new money. You can redirect money, but you can't have new money. So as long as you're able to make the House bill and the Senate bill coincide through the reconciliation process, and then the House votes on it, then that becomes law unless it goes to the president for a veto. Suppose we have the final law, and there's a court case, and it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's primary role is to rule on what the law states, not to make law, not to decide if it's good law or bad law. That's for politicians, not for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can only theoretically adjudicate according to the law. Unfortunately, we live starting with the 20th century with some confusion among people in the courts that use the court to legislate. But let's not talk about that. But theoretically, that's the way it should work. Suppose it's very unclear what the legislative intent was. You could bring a House bill or the Senate bill prior to reconciliation, which was not adopted into law, for the sole purpose. This is not law, and the Supreme Court won't rule on it. But if there's a question of intent, then the Supreme Court can look at that prior to reconciliation and help to divine what the intent was. We, of course, rely on this in the debate over the borders of Israel, because there are still those, when they talk about the partitioning, and it made it very clear that it said borders, not the borders. And of course, what happened, because the world is anti-Semitic, that's a given. And what they did was calmly wait till people would forget, and they claimed these are the borders. But if you'll go back to the United Nations legislative intent, all the documents leading up to it, there were like signing documents. When they signed, they preserved the thinking behind it. So later, if people were come to say, here's how I interpret it, the people who wrote this and the General Assembly that voted on it, what were the words and what were the intent behind the words. And that no, we did not write the borders. We wrote borders, not the borders.
Which thing are you speaking about?
In the United Nations.
242 or
242, yeah, Resolution 242. Courts cannot rule from the grave. No legislature can make a rule that's for all time. Because if that's the case, why bother having a legislature next year? And no court can rule for all time, because why bother having a court next year? So just because there was some rule that was written, what does that, so what? So the answer is, if you want to go and have a new rule and a new vote, go do it. Nobody's stopping you. But if you're talking about interpreting the law as the law sits here today before us, then one of the tools that you can use is to see what the intent was behind it. The Brices were not accepted in final format for one reason or another by Rabbi Judah the Prince. But if we're trying to interpret the Mishnah, we can certainly look at the various Brisiot and see, help us to understand what the intent was. And that's their use. The Tosefta, on the other hand, although it's occasionally used in that fashion, generally it's not. Generally, Tosefta is what we would call a supplement, an addition. It's not really a commentary. It follows the Mishnah exactly. The Brises don't. The Brises are just scattered all over the place. They're just scattered all over the place. The Tosefta is formal, just like the Mishnah. It follows the Mishnah, and many of the words are identical, but it has a lot of explanatory material. All right. So that I had mentioned last time that I would mention about the Brises. That's the only reason why I'm saying this now.
Is there a way to look at the Braita or the Mishnah and to see exactly when they started to write them?
There are some Mishnayot, there's some Brisiot that talk about boundaries that didn't exist prior to certain times and didn't exist after certain times. Especially, as you know, King Solomon went all the way up to the Tigris and Euphrates by agreement from Damascus, because at the time there was the ascension of King David's armies, and the people that lived today in Syria were concerned about other countries on top of them, the Parthians to the east and others to the west. And because King Solomon inherited an army from King David that was the fiercest army in the land, although Egypt at the time was rather defanged. So it was in their best interest to enter into treaties with King Solomon for protection. And so actually you could call it a satellite all the way up to the Tigris and the Euphrates. So sometimes when we're talking about those boundaries, well, you know that the origin of whatever this law is couldn't have been before King Solomon had this treaty, went up there. Similarly, in Israel, there are certain laws about the Galil. Does it count if a person wants to deliver a bill of divorce to his wife? So if he delivers it to a messenger in Israel proper, then it's considered that you have signature required and return receipt. But up in the Galil, due to the bandits that were here and there, so at certain periods of time, if you gave it to a representative there, that doesn't mean anything. Who's to say he's going to live long enough to make it to the lower 48? And as a result, we hold in abeyance the decision. Well, so it's very clear when you tell me that there is a Mishnah that deals with this. This must be placed in the time period where, so we have definitive ways of determining this. But that's all irrelevant because it coalesced into a body of law with Rabbi Judah the Prince. And so what happened beforehand is not incumbent on us after that. And if there were differences of opinion, which prior to Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik there weren't any, and from Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik till Hillel were the 5 pairs, generally speaking, in the first generation they had a difference of opinion on 1 or 2 things, and then 3 or 4 things, and 4 or 5 things. And by the time you got to Hillel and Shammai, there were a couple dozen things. And when you got to Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, their students, there were thousands of differences between them. But the way they would be resolved was you would take a vote, and the majority opinion rules. When Rabbi Judah the Prince wrote the Mishnah, as I mentioned last time, he was a Sanhedrin of 1 because all of his teachers were killed, and nobody else was alive who were students of his teachers. Although we have many people relaying rules and regulations, like Rabbi Yochanan will say, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Well, he wasn't a student of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So the answer is no, but he learned this in his name, and so he wanted to promulgate this in his name. There were no differences of opinion. Now, of course, immediately after the Mishnah was written, we start up again with differences of opinion, including the Shema that we're eventually going to get to today. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Did anybody ever write down an actual date for anything? That Rabbi Yehuda Anossi, any Talmidim, did they ever write down a date on when they said something? Is that found anyplace?
Yes, there are a number of occasions where they will say that this happened when the Romans did this. This happened when the Romans did that. The problem is, in secular history, we have a debate, when did the Romans do it? We know that the Romans did it, but when did they do it? So there are plenty of examples like that. Just for example, in the canon, you will have in the book of Daniel, during this year of the reign of so-and-so. All right, so yeah, there are plenty of examples like that.
Nothing from Brias Ha'olam, since the world was created. Just like we say now, 5-7.
Usually time didn't go that way. Time didn't go according to the beginning of creation. That's not how it was done. It was usually done in the Shemitah / Jubilee year. That's how time was kept. Or it was by...
Could have begun when?
Not the first day of creation.
They didn't, no, but
I worked it out myself going all the way back. Pardon me?
Not even when they came into Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
The first 14 years was nothing.
Exactly, because I worked it back myself, and it turns out if you go all the way, if you divide by the current year and the number of jubilees, it doesn't start back with year 1. You end up in the middle of a cycle. So obviously it didn't start then. And also when Joshua conquered Jericho, it didn't happen then either. Yeah. But it did start at a definitive date, and that's why we know what the Shemitah and Jubilee is now. That's one way of counting. Another way of counting is the year of the monarch, either the Jewish king or the conquering king or a neighboring king.
But that's also not accurate because each year was counted, one day was counted as the year.
So you get into problems. You get this with Daniel and his weeks. What does weeks mean? Weeks doesn't mean years. And then furthermore, if weeks mean years, does it mean a full year or a partial year? I once in yeshiva asked the rabbi that we see very clearly in counting the years, without a doubt, that a fraction of a year counts as a year. We even see that if the kingship went over into a few hours into the day, it counts as the whole year. So I asked, if I wake up Yom Kippur morning and I fasted till this point, does that count for the whole day? And for some reason, which I was never given the reason, apparently it doesn't work when it comes to fast days. He said no. I tried. I did my best, but it didn't happen. Okay. So let's take a look now with all that preface with the Mishnah. If you'll look at the copy that you have, you see in the big letters at the top, this is, once again, Rabbi Art Scroll's version. And you'll see in the large letters in Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, which I had a debate recently with someone who said there's no such thing as Mishnaic Hebrew. And I said, Hain. And he said, feminine they are? I said, no, Hain. And he said, feminine they are. And I said, no, Hain. Hain is Mishnaic Hebrew for yes. So obviously there is Mishnaic Hebrew. And Rabbi Judah the Prince is...
What do you mean there's no Mishnah Hebrew?
There, I had a conversation with someone that you know who claimed that because he's an Israeli, then he has the ability to interpret like he would translate a newspaper or a magazine. And so I said, well, there's biblical Hebrew, there's Mishnaic Hebrew, and then there's modern Hebrew, Ben Yehuda. And he vehemently opposed that notion. And he said, there's no such thing.
The davening in many places.
I know. Yeah, so I said to him, Hain. And he said, feminine, there is. I said, no. Hain is Mishnaic for yes. Rabbi Judah the Prince was recognized by everyone in his generation of being the master of Mishnaic Hebrew. He was the greatest writer of Mishnaic Hebrew. He had what we call a rabbinical hand. He had the ability to write with perfection. We don't see the likes of that, of what he wrote, until we get to the Balapiyutim, the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the poets, which I have a personal grudge against, who wrote all these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poems that made the Yom Kippur davening, the prayers for Yom Kippur, from a 30-minute prayer to all day.
And you don't know what they're talking about.
I don't know what they're talking about, but I can tell you the Hebrew is perfection. They were the Balei Dikdukim. It's just phenomenal. And we don't see that again until we get to Maimonides. I mean, it's very rare that we see these types of things. Rashi quotes that was the Aruch, I think. So I think that was the dictionary of the day. But he was one of the last of the age of the poets, as it were. But you're talking about one in a millennium, 1 in 1,000 years. His Hebrew is so precise. So it starts off and it says, Me'emosai, from where, and I can stop right there and already begin my complaint.
From where?
From where?
Not
Or from when? From when? Or from what time? Okay, you're technically correct, from when. But I'm already at a disadvantage. If a person asks you, what time does the Michigan State championship NCAA game start? Do we know that they will get past the Final Four to go to the finals? So if I say to you, what time does the game start? Why? I want to arrange my schedule. I've got a calendar. I've got a busy person. I've got places to go. I've got people to see. I have things to do. I need to arrange what time is the game going to start when Michigan State's going to play in the finals. Aren't you presupposing that they're making it to the finals? Who said till now that they made it to the finals? We don't know this. So if you start up, this is the beginning of all the Mishnayos. It starts off, obviously, not at the beginning. From when? From what point are you allowed to do whatever it is that we're going to say? You should first tell me there's a rule that you have to do something. The person say, all right, tell me the characteristics. Tell me the parameters. So it starts off with the assumption that you're Jewish. You have inherited the Torah from Moses. going all the way back to Har Sinai. Why are you starting off that way? This teaches a very important principle of the Mishnah. The Mishnah assumes that, not that you know the details of what the law are, but that you understand that Judaism is not beginning right now. We didn't just fall off the turnip wagon today. The Jewish people have been saying Shema, which is the pronouncement of monotheism, since Abraham our father. And in all the time that it's passed since then, we know it's an obligation. We will look later to find out what is the obligation. We will look to see, is the obligation to do it in the evening or in the morning. We will look to see the obligation, the first verse, the first two paragraphs, and the third paragraph. We will look to see later, is the obligation biblical? Is it rabbinical? Those are minor details. But nobody till now would say, when do you have to say the Shema? Who said you had to say the Shema? We know this. And in fact, this sets the stage throughout the Mishnah, and furthermore, it sets the stage throughout the Talmud. The arguments in the Talmud always assume that you know about tefillin. The question is, but if you didn't know about tefillin, how could you derive it yourself? If you found yourself waking up one day on a desert island, how would you know that you have an obligation to put on tefillin? Letotafot, how do you know from letotafot? That's not even Hebrew. So how do you know that there is, and I claim that totafot means onions. You should take an onion and put it on your forehead, as a frontlet between your eyes. Who said it's tefillin? And how do you know that it's made out of leather? And how do you know that it's painted black? And how do you know that, everybody knows this. Everyone has always known this. We've known this literally since Moses was a corporal. I was never able to use that phrase legitimately, but now I can use it legitimately. Right, we know he ended up being a general, but this was known since Moses was a corporal.
Actually, this is one of the things that I have never heard an explanation about it. What you say, you're right. I mean, what is the totafot? What is the totafot?
So we will have a tradition, the oral Torah, that'll explain it. This is no more of a perplexing dilemma than when God said, okay, they want to eat meat, let them slaughter it in the manner in which I have commanded. Commanded, that sounds pretty impressive. Not that I've alluded to, or that I have hinted at, or that I secretly told you in a tent, but I've commanded. It sounds like, whoa, this sounds like a Mount Sinai play. So if you will look from cover to cover, from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy, are you supposed to strangle it? Are you supposed to take a machete and whack off its head? How are you supposed to kill it? Where does it say this? And so the answer is, apparently there is an oral law, and people knew it. So when it came along to Shechita, no one said to Moses, what is God talking about here? They all knew.
Nobody explained the word totafot. What does that mean?
And so the same tradition that told you all the rest is the same tradition that tells you that it's tefillin and not onions. And in fact, in the Gemara itself, it'll tell us about that. And we can go to one of the minor tractates that no one learns in Daf HaYomi, and it will go...
Yeah,
Well, there's all kinds of explanations.
They put the something.
You can split the word up into two parts. Yeah, there are all kinds of explanations, but all the explanations are all secondary. It's not Hebrew. We can all agree upon it's not Hebrew. If you go take a look in the minor tractates, which were codified in the 8th and 9th centuries, long after, you will see Maseches Sofrim. It will go into the details about it at length. This is not the first word in the Torah that's not Hebrew. The very first word of the Ten Commandments, Anochi, is not Hebrew.
But
And you go to the book of Daniel, and he doesn't even spell God in Hebrew, for goodness sakes. He spells God in Aramaic. So Me'emosai, from when, from what time, presupposes that you already know the preamble. You already know what the Shema is. I'm not going to tell you, oh, here's news. Did you know that you have to affirm monotheism? We've been doing that since Moses. We've been doing that since Abraham. Me'emosai korin. Now we have our second problem. We're only in the second word. We have our second problem. The word korin, with a nun at the end, korin means to read out of a book. We have a word that a person should say. We have a word, how to say. Amar, lemor, if you want to conjugate it. Korin means to do it in a sefer. Where do we find that a person has to say the Shema in a book? So here is the answer to the one who says there's no such thing as Mishnah Hebrew. Yes, in biblical Hebrew, it's possible that Korah means to read from a scroll, but in Mishnaic Hebrew, not at all. It no more means to read out of a scroll than it means to recite. And therefore, we translate it as recite. And that's why it says, Vayikra el Moshe, Vaydaber el Bnei Yisrael lemor. It says, and God wrote the book. He sent him a letter. I remember when I was in Israel in 1971, it was popular amongst the Christians to translate and mistranslate on the mistranslations in slang in order for their missionary activities. And so there was a Good News for a Modern Man was one version, and another one was, it was just written in the common slang du jour. And I picked it up on the bookshelf there. It was in Hebrew, and I looked at it, and I don't remember the conjugation, but v'tzalzel. God gave Moses a ring. God rang up Moses. He texted him. He Twittered him or whatever. I mean, so Vayikra, it's very clear. It says God called, to call out. So the word korin doesn't necessarily mean to read. So why do we read the Megillah in a scroll? Because we said Ageris Hazos. We said this particular document.
But Vayikra
Means call, not write.
I know, but most of the time is you read.
Correct. Which is the problem. That's why I'm bringing this as a problem.
Yeah.
And so
Oh,
the
I thought
answer
you
is
said no.
no. I
Oh,
said it's a
okay.
problem.
Oh.
I said in biblical Hebrew it's a problem. In Lashon HaKodesh it's a problem. You're going to have to give me the context before I can tell you.
Right.
In Mishnaic Hebrew I don't. In Mishnaic Hebrew I'm just as likely to use the word korin to say in a scroll as I am to say recite. So the first two words, the first is the assumption that you already know about being Jewish, and the second is that the words that we use are a language that's specific to Mishnaic Hebrew. So me'em mosai korin es Shema. From when can a person recite the Shema? You have to ask yourself a couple of questions here. This is in one of the 6 orders that's called seeds. Now we understand why Rabbi Judah the Prince would start with the laws of seeds, because the Jewish people, as I mentioned at length last time, were agriculturally based. As I mentioned last time, during the first destruction and the second destruction, Nebuchadnezzar came and Titus came, they went, they did, they that, but the farmers were, generally speaking, unaffected. And the reason why was because they were the ones that had stuff and they were the ones that could pay taxes. So we know that the people were a people of the land, our attachments to the land. So we understand why you wouldn't want to start with tort law or family court. You don't want to start there. Or ceremonial law. It's obvious that the people were agriculturally based. It's understandable that he would start with the laws of agriculture. But why is the benediction or prayers, this was called brachos, why the blessings, why is this in the chapter on seeds? What's it got to do with agriculture? And even if you'll come up with an answer for that, what's that got to do with saying the Shema prayer? And the answer is that everything in the world, including the crops that we grow, are for our benefit and for our pleasure. And even though biblically we have an obligation to eat, to be satiated, and to praise God for allowing us to benefit, there is no biblical requirement anywhere to praise God before you've had this delicacy, before you've tasted it. The rabbis instituted that a person should show their gratitude to the Almighty for giving us all the pleasures that we have in this world, and instituted that we make a blessing prior to eating, a blessing prior to benefiting. In fact, all the blessings that we say before an action are rabbinic, with perhaps the exception of lighting the Sabbath candles.
For sure rabbinic.
No, to light the Sabbath candles is for sure rabbinic. But we can't say the blessing and then light them because it will be Sabbath already. So the fact that we light the Sabbath candles itself is rabbinic. That's clear. That's just like, for example, the fact that you decided to eat meat. That's up to you. But once you eat meat, it becomes an obligation to do shechita, to slaughter. Nobody said you have to, it's an obligation biblically to buy a house. You want to buy a house, you don't want to buy a house, it's your business. But once you decide to buy a house, nobody told you to put on a four-cornered garment. But once you decided to put on a four-cornered garment, in all these cases it becomes an obligation to put a mezuzah on the doorpost or to put tzitzis, fringes on it. So if you're going to light the candles, if the way you're going to usher on the Sabbath, it becomes biblical to light it first and then say the blessing, because if you say the blessing first and take on the Sabbath, and then you light it, whoops, you can't kindle a fire. Okay, but generally speaking, the blessings always come beforehand for rabbinic reasons. That happens to be an exception.
Why do I have to say amotzi if the baker that baked that should have blessed the motzi, and that's going to be forever?
So the answer is we're not Arabic and Muslims. Okay, we
No,
don't.
no,
This is not halal. We are not blessing the food. What we're doing is we are giving praise and gratitude for the Almighty for providing this benefit to us.
Right.
If you don't steal something, you go in the store and you pay it. And so no one wants thank yous, people want the dollar bills. But when it comes to God, God doesn't need your dollar bills, God wants your gratitude.
That's not the meaning, what I meant. What I mean is this. When you bless a motzi, you're actually making that bread because you are actually taking some wheat and make that bread at that time. If you want to bless God, you say,
No.
and bless God.
Yes, I understand your question. We
understand my
we do this at certain times. For example, during the time that we are making the bread of affliction, which is otherwise known as matzah, we always say, while we're doing l'shem matzah's mitzvah, that to imbue in the making of the bread that it's for the sake of matzahs. However, there is no commandment to make bread. If a person wants to make bread as a hobby or as a sculptor, he wants to sculpt loaves of bread, that's his business.
That's good that you are actually straightening my...
No, but the benefit comes before you eat it. So before you eat it, you make the blessing. It's not shakol, it's bread. But that's b'diavad. That's not ab initio. That's not lechatchila.
What's the word?
Ab initio.
Which means?
That's Latin for lechatchila, yeah.
Ab initio.
Ab initio, yes.
Okay. Ab initio.
So from when can we recite the Shema in the evening prayers, ba'arvis? So of course we're going to bring up the question, why are you starting off at night? Everybody begins each new day in the morning. We'll get to that later. So the answer is mishah, from the moment or the hour, shako hanim, that the priests, nichnasim, plural, that they come in, le'echol, to eat, bis masan, their truma, which is already a problem. Whose other truma would they eat? Of course they're eating their own truma. So the answer is there's different kinds of truma. There are different kinds of sacrifices that the Torah refers to truma, not the tithe of agriculture. So Rabbi Judah the Prince wanted to make sure here that we're not talking about that kind of truma. We meant his truma or his family's truma, the truma that you give to the Kohen. That's the truma from your fields. That's why it says his truma. So that's the time that you can begin it. Ad until sof ha'ashmura harishon, to the end of the first watch. So there was either 3 or in some opinions 4 parts of the night where people, Kohanim, worked in shifts for the night shift. Why did they have to be there all together? So first of all, that's like asking in the ICU, why do you need to have any nurse on call? I mean, so the answer is if you have something important to you, it needs to be watched. I remember when I first went to St. Petersburg, became the shliach of Pinellas County. I was there not more than a few days, where someone had passed away, and I got a call from the funeral home. None of the conservative synagogues that were in existence there at the time, or the Reform synagogues, had any interest in it, but they needed a shomer, someone there at the funeral home, to be there for the whole night. And it's customary to say Tehillim at night. We normally do not say Tehillim at night because it awakens the attention of God, and we don't want to have God's attention at night, because that's the time where usually it's going to be judgment. We would rather have awaken God's mercy, which is during the day. There are exceptions to the rule. On the Sabbath and on the Yom Tov, on the holidays, we can say Tehillim at night. And in front of a deceased, a dead body, we're allowed to recite the Psalms. Just as a sidebar, I once heard that you're not permitted to give tzedakah, charity, at night. I asked my Rosh Yeshiva, is that true? And he said, the Mastama people who hold by that rule don't give tzedakah during the day either. So there's absolutely no reason why you can't give tzedakah at night. It's just that that's not the time usually that's set for giving tzedakah. We have a time for giving tzedakah every day during the morning prayers. There's a certain place where we give tzedakah. And obviously if somebody comes who is needy, an opportunity presents itself. But if that person happens to arrive after the sun is set, you can't say, come back tomorrow, because unfortunately it's against my custom to give charity at night. There's no such thing. Until the end of the first watch, you need to have said Shema by then.
St. Petersburg, you had to go watch?
What was that?
You started saying in Petersburg.
When I was in St. Petersburg, where I was the shliach for Pinellas County, I was the
St. Petersburg, Russia?
Florida.
Oh, it's St. Petersburg, Florida.
I was the shliach. I actually was paid by Rabbi Chadakov. I was on the official list. I was the rabbi of the county. So I didn't work for a shliach. I was the shliach, and therefore I got paid directly by Rabbi Chadakov. Yeah, I took 1/3 of the money and gave it to local tzedakah. I took the other 1/3 of the money and I gave it to the Chabad house itself, and the other 1/3 of the money I gave it to Yeshiva Bacher, who wanted to go to law school, but he couldn't afford it. So I didn't keep any of the money. The Chachamim, V'chachamim Omrim, so Rabbi Eliezer, we just said Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, this idea that you can say it till the end of the first watch is according to Rabbi Eliezer. But the Chachamim, which means Rabbi Eliezer, is a minority opinion. The majority opinion is the rabbis. And if you want to root for one opinion or the other, I would advise you to go towards the majority in most cases. The Chachamim, they said Ad Chatzos. You can go all the way, in fact, midnight, the middle of the evening.
So why does he even bring down a minority opinion if that's not
The question, this question is asked in many Mishnayot. Why does Rabbi Judah Prince bring down the minority opinion? The answer is because some Talmud Chacham will rise later in life and they'll say, I thought of something they didn't think about. And so the answer is not only we thought about it, we voted on it, and the answer is no. So that's a very good question with a well-known answer. Rabbi Gamliel Omer, but Rabbi Gamliel says, so Rabbi Judah the Prince is quoting now his own relative, so this is a third opinion. The truth is, Ad She'aleh Amud HaShachar. You're allowed to do it until the light of dawn arises. We have three opinions now. The end of the first watch, which is early in the evening. You can make this monotheistic pronouncement up until midnight, or you can do it right before the first rays of sunlight come over the horizon. Three different time periods. That pretty much nails it down, right? Now I know I can set my watch by that. That's such a broad answer. I don't know why I asked the question. Now we have an interesting technique which does not occur very often. It's surprising that it's in the very first Mishnah. Perhaps because it was a personal incident. Sometimes we learn by quoting a verse. Sometimes we learn by quoting the sage who recalled the tradition from Moses, Halacha LaMoshe Sinai. Sometimes we learn by the hermeneutical rules of Rabbi Yishmael. We derive it by that. Sometimes we do it by logic. Sometimes we do it by a majority, a rove. Sometimes we do it by hapesha, asu hapesha hitter. The mouth that binds is the mouth that frees. There are all kinds of ways. Sometimes we even do an experiment. There are several cases where they do conduct an experiment to see. In this case, it's called a Maisa Shahaya, an event, an incident that occurred. So in order to help us sort through the three opinions on when you can say the Shema, when's the last moment that you can say the Shema, an incident is given. So Ma'aseh, he starts off with the word, it's a Maisa, it's an incident. Sheba Banav, mi beis hamishta, his two sons came home. Amru lo, they said to him, Lo karinu es Shema, we didn't say Shema. Now technically, if you translate it literally in modern Hebrew, they came home from a bar. They came home from a house of drinking. That's what it says.
Or Bet HaMishteh, it's a party that they have.
That is an interpretation. But literally, it's a house of drinking that came from a pub. But in Mishnaic Hebrew, what it means is a festive dinner, or typically it was associated with Sheva Brachos, with the party after the wedding. And so they came home from a wedding, and it was very late. So Amrullah, they asked him, Lo Karina es Shema, we have not yet recited the Shema. Should we say it or not? Is there a point to doing it? Have we missed the opportunity? If you miss the opportunity, it's not called an Aveira. It's called a Chet. A Chet is when you had an opportunity to do something and you didn't. How do we know this? Because King David had 3,000 archers who were left-handed, v'lo chatayim. They were so accurate, they never missed. A Chet is when you had the opportunity to do something and you didn't. An Aveira is when you're not supposed to do something and you did it anyway. So this is not an Aveira, this is a Chet. And so they wanted to avoid a Chet. Do we still have time to do this?
Why,
So-
in fact, did they not say it?
They were drinking and partying, and they didn't think about it. They walked home, they looked at their father's beard, they saw their holy father, and they said, whoops, we didn't say Shema. Is it too late, baby, now? Not to quote any lyrics.
The word miss,
What?
the word miss, to miss. You mentioned
Yeah.
the 3,000.
The word chet means to miss, yes.
Yeah, the hehti
Right.
for one person is to miss.
Yes, I'm
Hehtiu
agreeing.
is a miss.
Yeah, I'm agreeing.
I'm just
Yeah. So he said, as long as im lo Allah amud hashachar, as long as the dawn is not yet arisen, atem, you, the two of you, can recite it. Likros, you can recite it. V'lo zo bilvad. And I'm glad you asked that, because this principle does not just apply to saying of the Shema, el kol ma she'amru chachamim, but any place where we find the sages say that the time limit is ad chatzos, as until midnight, mitzvasan, the actual fulfillment of the commandment, ad shiyah le'amud hashachar. You can continue to do so until the morning light. What's the reason for this? Because even though there's no biblical prayer in the evenings, there was a sacrificial offering in the morning, and there was a sacrificial offering in the afternoon. There were the prayers of Abraham in the morning and Isaac in the afternoon. Jacob, who gave prayers in the evening, there's no analogy to that in the temple sacrifices. Be that as it may, if a person began the sacrifice in the mincha offering and he just got it started just before the evening arises, does it count as a sacrificial offering into the evening? Yes or no? Does the time period count, or is it a cutoff? And the answer is yes. He gets full credit for the sacrificial offering in the evening, but the fats and the meats are still burning, so it's considered, yes, it's still legitimate, a part of the time of the mitzvah. We see from this, hekter chalavim ve'ivarim, that the time of the burning of the fats and the limbs on the altar, mitzvasim, their commandment extends ad shiyala amud hashachar. There's no cutoff time because the sun set. V'chol hane'echalim liyom echad. And furthermore, any of the parts of the sacrifice that you're required to eat for one day, you're allowed to eat it all the way until the dawn. For example, if you bring a chatas offering, a sin offering, so there's parts of it that goes to the Kohen, there's parts of it that burns on top of the altar, and there's parts of it that you're required to eat. And depending upon the type of sacrifice it is, some parts you have to eat it within one day, but you don't have to rush to eat it before the sun sets. You can eat it all the way through the night. Im kain, that being the case, of course, in the language and the voice of the Mishnah, if the truth of the matter is, which time period of the three, the end of the first watch, midnight, or the early morning, which one encompasses them all? Obviously, the one that encompasses them all is the light of morning. So if that's the truth of the matter, why did the rabbis bother to say chatzos? Why did they bother to say till midnight? We don't have to talk about Rabbi Eliezer. Why did he say the first watch? Because that was a minor opinion, but certainly the majority opinion. Why did they say this? Is to teach us an important principle, which probably goes to the heart of the answer why he started off with this Mishnah. Kedei laharchik adam min ha'avera, is to distance a person from sin. And now you know what is the role of the rabbis. The role of the rabbis are not to sprinkle holy water on people and change them. The rabbis have no ability to convert. They cannot convert somebody. You either have a nefesh elokis, a divine soul hovering over you, like it says by Noah hovering over you, and we will find out if that's the case by having you do a circumcision, immersing in a mikveh, and by taking an oath. That convert you, but I can't sprinkle some holy water on you and yes, you're in the club. I have no ability to do that. The rabbis cannot do what in other religions could, they will say some incantation, be it in Latin, be it in Arabic, or in Hindu, or any other languages. The rabbis do not have the ability to create yesh me'ayin, something from nothing at all. That's not their role. For example, we have the so-called aguna problem, which the feminists say if the rabbis had wanted to solve the problem of a man who refuses to give a get to his wife of his own volition, and he won't give it, and as a result she can't remarry. If the rabbis really wanted to solve this problem, they'd find a way. The answer is the rabbis have been trying for thousands of years, but they do not have a cachet of holy water to sprinkle on the woman to make her freed from the previous marriage. They're not a bunch of godettes or godlets. They don't have the power to do this. And one of the things that they were authorized to do is to put a fence around the Torah, is to put a protective device to stop you from getting too close to the precipice. Because if you get too close to the precipice and somebody bumps you, what happens? You touch it. A person spends his time plotting about how going to knock over a 7-Eleven, and he's trying to make this the perfect crime. And he spends all of his life, he investigates surveillance equipment and the proper kinds of ropes to use, and look when does the guard come and what kind of alarm systems they are, and so on and so on. But he never really means to do it. He's writing a novel. This is just research, and he researches it, and he thinks about it, and he dreams about it. Eventually, when he goes ahead and does it, and he says, "I couldn't stop myself." You had plenty of chances to stop. Well, apparently, if it's when left to his own devices, mankind does not have the ability to bring himself to the brink and stop. The role of the rabbis is you have until the break of dawn to do it. The role of the rabbis is to erect a protective fence and say, you cannot do it past midnight. And the rabbis can take all of their devices, they can give you a monetary fine, they can incarcerate you, not necessarily for saying the Shema, but for other things, for not following the rules of the rabbis. They can even, in some cases, give you lashes. And it's much worse to get the lashes from the rabbis than it is for a biblical infraction, because a biblical infraction is limited to the number of lashes that you can have, whereas there's no limitation from the rabbis. So the roles of the rabbis is simply not only to interpret and to judge, but to make protective devices.
Who said that's the role of the rabbi?
Because the verse says, if the matter is too difficult to you, you shall take it to the Elohim, and they shall decide for you, which are the rabbis.
That means to adjudicate, to tell you not to go, not to play nurse baby, and to make all the laws to separate you.
And so that's in Perkei Avos, which is a Mishnah. In the Mishnah it says that the role is to make a fence around the Torah. Now your complaint by quoting the Mishnah...
is for everybody. That's not the rabbi.
No. He's making that rule for everyone, including himself. You have a better complaint against that proof. That's the suspect testifying on himself. How do we know that the rabbis are entitled to make protective fences? Because the rabbis told us. Yeah, so that's circuitous. And not only is it circuitous, but it's circular.
Right.
And not only circular, it's redundant. Okay. But the earlier question is that if you don't know what to do, the question was, I don't know what to do. Can I say Shema or not? The answer is go to the Elohim. Go to the judges. They will tell you. That's their role. Also, we have other sources that why does it repeat and says this is the judgments, the commandments, and the statutes. So it's to tell you all the different things. We're at Sinai. So let's review. What do we learn in this first Mishnah?
Why does the Mishnah say Lama Amru Chacham Mat Chatzos?
Right.
It's not just a matter of Amru. Lama Posku Chacham Mat Chatzos.
And the answer is, and so the Gemara says exactly that. They can't paskin. They can certainly say. And the reason why is the Gemara is later going to argue. And what if a person did?
Did what?
He went ahead and he said it later. He violated the rules. Does he get credit for the mitzvah or not? No, according to the Torah, he gets credit for saying a Torah pasuk. I didn't ask you if he got a credit for saying a Torah pasuk. I'm asking, does he get a credit of having done the evening prayer, which he's obligated in the evening and the morning? If it's not evening anymore, does he get credit for it? Yes or no?
According to the Torah, yes. According to Chachomim, initially, no.
And that's why they don't want to say the word pas. It's not psak halacha, because you do get credit for it, according to some opinions. So, yes, but it's like a suggestion from from the president. If the president suggests that you come to a meeting, you get a plane ticket, unless you're a Democrat.
כתוב, it says in Shema, "V'shchavecha avkumecha." So when you go to sleep.
We can get to that. That's going to be later.
Okay.
This is just the first Mishnah.
Moses, yeah.
Okay, gentlemen and lady, that's as far as we're going to go today.
Very nice.